Hi, I'm Zoe. 3 months ago, my stepfather Rick sat across from me in a glass conference room, his face pale as I slid the inheritance documents toward him. The same man who told me 18 years earlier that he wouldn't waste a single dollar on my education because I wasn't his blood was now begging me to release his own inheritance. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. I looked him in the eye and said the same words he'd said to me all those years ago. Family takes care of family, Rick. But you made it clear I'm not family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The memory takes me back to a humid August evening in 2006, when I was 17 and the college acceptance letters were piling up on my desk, like promises I couldn't keep. I'd spent months researching scholarships, filling out financial aid forms, and working double shifts at the local coffee shop to save every penny I could. Portland State had offered me partial academic scholarships, but it still wasn't enough to cover everything. The gap between my dreams and my bank account felt like an ocean. I remember walking into the kitchen where Rick was reading his newspaper, the sports section spread across our small dining table. My mother Linda was washing dishes, her back turned to us both, but I could tell she was listening by the way her shoulders tensed when I cleared my throat. Rick didn't look up when I approached, just continued reading about the Trailblazers' latest trade, as if I was invisible. "Rick," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I wanted to talk to you about college costs. Even with the scholarships and the money I've saved, I'm still about $8,000 short for the first year. I was hoping maybe we could work something out, like a loan or—" He finally looked up, his gray eyes cold and calculating. The newspaper crinkled as he folded it deliberately, taking his time like he was savoring the moment. "Zoe," he said, and I could already hear the dismissal in his tone. "I've been very clear about this. Tyler is starting his junior year at Oregon State, and that's where my money goes. You're not my blood. I don't owe you anything." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd heard variations of them for years. My mother's hands stilled in the soapy water, but she didn't turn around. She never did when Rick drew those invisible lines between his real family and me. I stood there for a moment, watching him return to his newspaper as if the conversation was over, as if my entire future was just an inconvenience interrupting his evening routine. "But I've lived here for 8 years, I said quietly. "I've helped with Tyler's homework. I've done chores. I've never asked for anything. And I've fed you and put a roof over your head for 8 years. Rick interrupted, not bothering to look up again. "That's more than enough. If you want to go to college so badly, figure it out yourself. Maybe you should have thought about that before choosing such an expensive dream." My mother finally turned around, dish soap still dripping from her yellow rubber gloves. For a moment, I thought she might say something, might stand up for me the way a mother should. Instead, she just looked between Rick and me with that familiar expression of helpless resignation. "Zoe, honey," she said softly, "maybe you could look into community college for a year or 2. It's more affordable, and then you could transfer." "Community college?" I felt something crack inside my chest. "Mom, I have a 3.9 GPA. I got into Portland State with academic scholarships. I'm not asking for charity here. I'm asking my family to help me the same way they helped Tyler." Rick slammed his newspaper down then, the sound sharp in our small kitchen. "Tyler is my son. You are not my daughter. I don't know how many different ways I need to say this for you to understand. My money goes to my blood family, first, second, and always." End of discussion. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the kitchen faucet dripping, the distant sound of our neighbor's television through the thin walls, the hum of the refrigerator. Normal sounds of a normal evening, in what was supposed to be my home. But standing there, looking at the 2 people who were supposed to care about my future, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I didn't storm out dramatically like teenagers do in movies. I just nodded slowly and said, "Okay, I understand." And I did understand, finally and completely. I understood that I would always be the outsider in this house, that my last name might be Hartwell Brennan on paper, but to Rick, I would never be anything more than Linda's baggage from her first marriage. That night, I sat in my small bedroom with my laptop, researching student loans and work-study programs until my eyes burned. The acceptance letter from Portland State was pinned to my bulletin board next to a photo of my biological father, who'd died in a car accident when I was 9. In the picture, he was teaching me to ride a bike, his hands steady on the seat as I pedaled forward with determination and joy. I wondered what he would have thought about Rick's refusal to help with my education. I wondered if he would have been proud of the grades I'd earned, the scholarships I'd won on my own merit. By 3 in the morning, I had a plan. It wasn't the plan I'd wanted, but it was the plan I had. I would take out the maximum student loans, work as many hours as I could while still maintaining my grades, and prove to everyone, especially myself, that I didn't need Rick Brennan's money or approval to succeed. The decision felt both liberating and terrifying, like jumping off a cliff and hoping I'd figure out how to fly on the way down. The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and preparation. I signed loan documents that would follow me for decades, registered for a full course load, and found a work-study position in the university's financial aid office. Rick barely acknowledged my presence during those final weeks at home, and when he did speak to me, it was only to remind me that I was making a mistake, that I was being ungrateful, that I would come crawling back when reality hit. My mother helped me pack in her own quiet way, slipping $20 bills into my textbooks and boxes of ramen noodles into my suitcase. She never said she was sorry for not standing up to Rick, but I could see the guilt in her eyes every time she looked at me. The morning I left for Portland State, she hugged me tighter than she had in years and whispered, "Make us proud, honey." Not make him proud, or make me proud, but make us proud, as if she was including herself in some imaginary version of our family where everyone wanted me to succeed. Rick didn't come outside to say goodbye. He stayed in the kitchen, drinking his coffee and reading his newspaper, the same routine he'd followed every morning for 8 years. Tyler, my stepbrother, gave me an awkward hug and muttered something about staying in touch, but we both knew the threads connecting us were thinner than spider silk. As my mother's car pulled away from the curb, I watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror until it was just another building in a neighborhood that had never really been mine. Portland State University felt like stepping into a different world. The campus buzzed with energy and possibility, students rushing between classes with backpacks full of dreams and textbooks. My dorm room was tiny, barely large enough for 2 twin beds and 2 desks, but it was mine in a way that the house in Beaverton had never been. My roommate was a girl named Kai Rodriguez from Salem, studying journalism with the kind of fierce ambition I recognized in myself. "Let me guess," Kai said on our first night, watching me organize my half of the room with military precision. "Scholarship kid working 3 jobs to pay for school?" I looked up from my color-coded binder system, surprised by her directness. "Is it that obvious?" "Takes one to know one," she said with a grin. "My parents own a restaurant, but 6 kids means college money gets stretched pretty thin. I'm here on academic scholarships, work study, and the kind of student loans that'll follow me to my grave." It was the first time in months that someone had understood my situation without making me feel ashamed of it. Kai became my anchor during those first overwhelming weeks of college, showing me which professors were understanding about students who had to work, which campus resources were worth the time, and how to survive on dining hall food and determination. The work-study position in the financial aid office turned out to be a blessing disguised as necessity. I spent 20 hours a week helping other students navigate the complex world of loans, grants, and scholarships, learning the system from the inside out. Mrs. Patricia Vance, the office director, took me under her wing almost immediately. She was a woman in her 50s who'd worked in financial aid for over 2 decades, and she had an uncanny ability to spot students who were trying to make it on their own. "You have good instincts for this work," she told me one afternoon as I helped a freshman understand her loan disbursement schedule. "Have you thought about what you want to major in?" I was sorting through a stack of scholarship applications, noting which students might qualify for emergency aid grants. "Business administration, with a focus on finance," I said. "I figure if I'm going to be dealing with money and debt for the rest of my life, I might as well understand how it all works." Mrs. Vance smiled, the kind of knowing smile that suggested she saw something I hadn't recognized in myself yet. "That's smart thinking. We get a lot of students who just want to get through college without understanding the financial implications. You're already thinking like someone who's going to be successful in business." Her confidence in me felt like water in a desert. For the first time since that night in Rick's kitchen, someone was looking at my future with optimism instead of doubt. I threw myself into my studies with the kind of focus that comes from knowing you can't afford to fail. Every assignment was a step toward proving that Rick had been wrong about me, that his blood family philosophy was just an excuse for small-minded thinking. My grades reflected my determination. I finished my freshman year with a 3.8 GPA, made the dean's list, and earned a small academic scholarship that would help with sophomore year costs. More importantly, I'd found my place in the world of finance and business, discovering that I had a natural talent for understanding complex financial systems and helping people navigate them. The summer between freshman and sophomore year, I stayed in Portland and worked full-time at a small accounting firm downtown. The pay wasn't great, but the experience was invaluable, and it meant I didn't have to go back to Beaverton and face Rick's smug satisfaction at what he probably assumed was my inevitable failure. My mother called every few weeks, updating me on Tyler's internship at his father's construction company and the family vacation to the Oregon coast that I wasn't invited to join.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"How's school going, honey?" she always asked, and I could hear the genuine concern in her voice mixed with something that might have been regret. "Really well, Mom," I would tell her, sharing my grades and accomplishments in careful doses. I didn't want to sound like I was bragging, but I also wanted her to know that I was thriving without Rick's support. Sometimes she would go quiet after I told her about making the dean's list or getting promoted at my work-study job, and I wondered if she was thinking about that night in the kitchen, about how differently things might have gone if she'd found the courage to speak up. Rick never asked about school when he occasionally answered the phone. If anything, he seemed determined to pretend that I was still the same dependent teenager who'd lived in his house, as if my independence was just a phase that would eventually end with me begging to come home. The few times we spoke directly, usually when I called to wish my mother happy birthday or check in during holidays, he would make pointed comments about how expensive college was, how student loans were a trap, how I should have listened to his advice about community college. "Still playing the college game, I see," he said during one particularly memorable conversation near the end of my sophomore year. "How's that debt treating you?" "I'm managing just fine," I replied, looking out my dorm window at the campus where I'd built a life he couldn't understand or control. "Actually, I just got accepted into an accelerated program that will let me finish my bachelor's degree a semester early." The silence on the other end of the line was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. Rick had always assumed that my academic success was some kind of lucky accident, that eventually I would hit a wall and come crawling back to his practical wisdom about knowing my place. The idea that I was not only surviving but excelling seemed to genuinely surprise him. "Well," he finally said, "don't get too cocky. The real world is a lot different than college." But I was already living in the real world, working 25 hours a week, managing my own finances, and building relationships with professors and mentors who saw my potential. The real world that Rick wanted to warn me about was the one where I needed his approval and support to succeed. I was creating a different real world, one where my value wasn't determined by whose blood ran through my veins. By the time I finished my junior year, I'd been promoted to a senior position in the financial aid office, helping train new work-study students and working directly with Mrs. Vance on policy recommendations. I'd also been accepted into several prestigious internship programs for the following summer, including one at Pacific Northwest Trust Management, a firm that specialized in estate planning and inheritance management for high-net-worth families. "This could be a real game-changer for you," Mrs. Vance said when I told her about the internship. "Trust management is a specialized field, and Pacific Northwest has an excellent reputation. They don't usually take undergraduate interns, so this is a significant opportunity." The internship interview was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Instead of meeting in a standard office, I was invited to the firm's downtown Portland headquarters, a sleek building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. The conference room where I met with the senior partners felt like something from a movie, all polished wood and leather chairs that probably cost more than my entire semester's tuition. David Kim, one of the founding partners, conducted the interview with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he didn't waste time on candidates who weren't serious. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, With an MBA from Stanford, and the kind of calm confidence that comes from managing other people's wealth successfully. Your academic record is impressive, he said, flipping through my transcript and recommendation letters. But more interesting to me is your work experience in financial aid. You've been helping people understand complex financial systems under pressure, often when they're dealing with emotional stress about money. That's exactly the kind of background we value in trust management. I'd prepared for typical interview questions about my strengths and career goals, but David's questions were more specific, more probing. He wanted to know how I'd handled difficult conversations with students who were facing financial crises, how I'd learned to balance empathy with practical advice, how I'd dealt with bureaucratic systems that didn't always work in people's favor. "Let me ask you something," he said toward the end of our conversation. "You've obviously worked hard to pay for your own education. How do you think that experience would help you relate to clients who are dealing with inherited wealth?" It was the kind of question that could have been a trap, asking someone with student loan debt to relate to people with trust funds. But I thought about my own family dynamics, about the way money had been used as a weapon to exclude me, about the complexity of family relationships when financial resources are involved. "I think money is never just about money," I said carefully. "Whether someone is struggling to pay for college or managing a multi-million-dollar inheritance, financial decisions are always emotional decisions. They're about power and control and what we think we deserve." My experience being excluded from my family's financial support taught me that money can be used to include or exclude people, to show love or withhold it. I think that perspective would help me understand clients who might be dealing with similar family dynamics, just on a different scale. David nodded slowly, making a note in my file. "That's exactly the kind of insight we're looking for. Trust management isn't just about moving money around. It's about understanding family dynamics, managing relationships, and sometimes helping people navigate very complex emotional situations involving wealth and inheritance." 2 weeks later, I got the call offering me the internship. The pay was more than I'd ever made in my life, enough to significantly reduce my student loan burden and give me a real financial foundation for my senior year. More importantly, it was the kind of opportunity that could launch a career, the chance to learn a specialized field from some of the best practitioners in the region. That night, I called my mother to share the news. Her pride was genuine and immediate, the kind of enthusiasm she'd never been able to show when Rick was in the room making his disapproving comments about my impractical dreams. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful," she said, and I could hear her moving into another room, probably to avoid Rick overhearing our conversation. "I'm so proud of you. Your father would be so proud too." She meant my biological father, not Rick, and the distinction felt important. We talked for almost an hour, longer than we'd talked since I'd left for college, and for the first time in years I felt like I had my mother back, at least partially. "Does Rick know about the internship?" I asked finally, not sure why I cared about his reaction, but unable to stop myself from wondering. My mother went quiet for a moment. "I haven't told him yet. You know how he gets when we talk about your school stuff. He thinks you're just putting off the inevitable." "What inevitable?" "Coming back home, getting a practical job, settling down. He thinks this college thing is just you being stubborn, that eventually you'll see he was right about not wasting money on education." The comment stung, but it also clarified something for me. Rick wasn't just indifferent to my success. He was actively hoping for my failure. He needed me to fail to justify his decision not to support my education, to prove that his blood family philosophy was correct. My success was a threat to his worldview, evidence that he'd made the wrong choice all those years ago. "Well," I said to my mother, "I guess we'll see who's right." The internship at Pacific Northwest Trust Management began the following Monday, and from the first day I knew I'd found my calling. The work was complex and challenging, involving everything from tax law to family psychology, but it felt like all my experiences had been preparing me for exactly this kind of career. I spent my days learning about estate planning, inheritance structures, and the intricate legal frameworks that governed how wealth passed from one generation to the next. More fascinating than the technical aspects was the human dimension of the work. I sat in on client meetings where families discussed multi-generational wealth transfer, watched David navigate delicate conversations about end-of-life planning, and learned how to balance fiduciary responsibility with family relationship management. Many of the clients were dealing with exactly the kind of family dynamics I understood intimately: Questions about who deserved what, how love and money intersected, how families could use wealth to include or exclude members. 3 weeks into the internship, David assigned me to assist with a particularly complex case involving a construction company owner who was updating his estate plan. The client's name was Richard Brennan, and when I saw it on the file, my heart stopped for a moment before logic kicked in. Brennan was a common enough name, and plenty of people owned construction companies. It couldn't possibly be my stepfather. But when the client walked into our conference room that Thursday afternoon, accompanied by his wife and adult son, I felt the blood drain from my face. It was Rick, looking exactly the same, except for a few more gray hairs and the kind of expensive suit he'd never worn when I lived in his house. Behind him was my mother, dressed in a navy blue dress I'd never seen before, and Tyler, now 25 and wearing a tie that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Rick stopped short when he saw me, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been panic. My mother's hands flew to her mouth, and Tyler looked back and forth between us like he was trying to solve a puzzle. For a moment, no one moved or spoke, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. David looked between us with the kind of professional calm that suggested he'd seen family drama in business settings before. "I take it you all know each other?" "This is my stepdaughter," Rick said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "I had no idea she worked here." The word stepdaughter felt strange in his mouth, more acknowledgement of our relationship than he'd given me in years. I stood up slowly, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, and looked Rick directly in the eye. "Hello, Rick," I said, my voice professional and calm. "Mom, Tyler." Then I turned to David with the kind of composure I'd learned from watching him handle delicate client situations. "I should mention that I have a personal relationship with the Brennan family. If that creates a conflict of interest, I'd be happy to step aside and let someone else handle this case." David nodded thoughtfully, studying the dynamics in the room with the same careful attention he brought to complex financial structures. "That's very professional of you to mention it, Zoe. Let me ask the clients. Would you prefer to work with a different team member, or are you comfortable proceeding with Zoe's assistance?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rick could ask for someone else and maintain his fiction that I was just Linda's irresponsible daughter who'd wasted money on college. Or he could acknowledge that I was competent enough to handle his family's estate planning, which would require admitting that my education had actually led somewhere worthwhile. I watched him struggle with the decision, his jaw working as he looked around the conference room that screamed professional success, at the documents spread across the polished table, at me standing there in my business suit and pearls looking nothing like the desperate teenager who'd asked him for college money 7 years earlier. "We can proceed," he said finally, his voice tight. "I'm sure Zoe is competent." The word competent was delivered like a concession speech, grudging and minimal, but it was also the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd ever received from him. I sat back down and opened my notepad, ready to take notes about his estate planning needs with the same professional detachment I'd bring to any client meeting. "Excellent," David said, moving seamlessly into business mode. "Now, Mr. Brennan, I understand you're looking to update your will and potentially establish some trust structures for your family's construction business. Let's start by reviewing your current assets and discussing your goals for wealth transfer." What followed was the most surreal 2 hours of my life. I sat there taking detailed notes as Rick discussed assets I'd never known existed: investment properties, business partnerships, retirement accounts, and stock portfolios that added up to a net worth in the mid-7 figures. This was the man who'd claimed he couldn't afford to help with my college costs, who'd made me feel guilty for asking for $8,000 when he apparently had enough wealth to require professional estate planning. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now the one helping him understand complex financial structures, explaining tax implications and inheritance strategies, with the expertise I'd gained from the education he'd refused to support. Every time he asked a question about trust management or estate planning, I found myself providing answers that demonstrated exactly how valuable my expensive college education had been. My mother sat quietly through most of the meeting, occasionally glancing in my direction with an expression I couldn't quite read. Tyler asked a few questions about his inheritance timeline, but mostly seemed focused on his phone. Rick maintained his professional demeanor throughout the meeting, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened every time I spoke with authority about financial strategies he didn't understand. Near the end of the meeting, David began explaining the process for establishing trust structures, and I realized with growing amazement that I was about to become professionally involved in managing Rick's wealth transfer, the same wealth he jealously guarded from me throughout my adolescence. One thing to consider, David said, is appointing a professional trust officer to manage the ongoing administration of these structures. It removes the burden from family members and ensures professional oversight of the assets. Rick nodded slowly, clearly not understanding the full implications of what David was suggesting. What kind of qualifications would someone need for that role? Typically a background in finance or business administration, experience with fiduciary responsibility, and strong analytical skills. As it happens, Zoe here is exactly the kind of candidate we look for when clients need trust officer services. Her educational background and experience in our firm make her well qualified for that type of role. The suggestion hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Rick's eyes widened as he processed what David was saying, that the stepdaughter he deemed unworthy of educational investment was now qualified to manage his family's wealth, that his refusal to support my college education had inadvertently led me to the exact skills needed to control his financial legacy. "That's something to consider," Rick said carefully, clearly hoping the conversation would move on to safer ground. But David, unaware of the family history he'd just stepped into, continued with professional enthusiasm. "Actually, given Zoe's connection to your family, it might be ideal. Trust administration often involves sensitive family dynamics, and having someone who understands the relationships and personalities involved can be invaluable." I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was marveling at the cosmic justice of the situation. The man who'd told me I wasn't family, who'd refused to invest in my future, was now being advised to put me in charge of his family's financial future. The education he'd dismissed as wasteful had given me the exact qualifications needed to manage his wealth. After the meeting ended and the Brennan family left, David and I sat in the conference room reviewing our notes. He seemed pleased with how the session had gone, noting several opportunities for complex trust structures that would benefit the firm's business. "That was interesting," he said finally, looking up from his legal pad. "I take it there's some family history there?" I considered how much to share, weighing professional discretion against the need to give David context for what he'd witnessed. "Rick married my mother when I was 9. We've had some disagreements over the years about family obligations and financial support." David nodded thoughtfully. "Family dynamics can be challenging in this business, but you handled yourself very professionally in there. I was impressed by how you maintained your composure while clearly dealing with some personal history." "Thank you," I said, and realized I meant it. The meeting had been emotionally intense, but it had also been professionally validating. I'd demonstrated my competence to the man who'd always doubted it, shown my expertise in the field he'd claimed was impractical, and discovered that his wealth was far greater than he'd ever revealed during those conversations about college costs. That evening, I sat in my small apartment overlooking the Pearl District, processing everything that had happened. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "It was wonderful to see you today, honey. You've done so well for yourself. I'm proud of you." I stared at the message for a long time, appreciating the sentiment while also recognizing its limitations. She was proud of me now, when my success was obvious and professionally impressive. But where had that pride been when I needed it most? When I was 17, and asking for help to achieve exactly this kind of success. An hour later, another text came through, this one from Tyler. "Hey, had no idea you were doing so well. Maybe we should catch up sometime." The sudden interest from family members who'd been largely absent from my life felt both gratifying and hollow. Their attention was conditional on my success, their pride contingent on my ability to impress them. It was the same pattern that had defined our relationships for years. They only valued me when I could offer them something useful. But Rick remained silent, no text or call or acknowledgement of what had transpired in that conference room. I imagined him at home, processing the reality that his unwanted stepdaughter was now qualified to manage his family's financial future, that his refusal to support my education had inadvertently prepared me for exactly this kind of professional responsibility. The next morning, David called me into his office with news that would change everything. Pacific Northwest Trust Management had received a formal request from the Brennan family to establish multiple trust structures, and they'd specifically requested that I serve as the primary trust officer for all their accounts. "I have to ask," David said, studying my face carefully, "are you comfortable taking on this level of responsibility with your family? Trust officer relationships can be complex under the best circumstances, and adding family dynamics could complicate things significantly." I thought about 17-year-old me, sitting in that kitchen, while Rick explained that his money went to his blood family first, second, and always. I thought about the years of student loans, the work-study jobs, the determination that had carried me through college and into this career. I thought about the cosmic justice of being asked to manage the wealth of the man who declared me unworthy of his financial support. "I can handle it," I said, and meant every word. What I didn't know then was that handling Rick's trust management would be the least complicated part of what was coming. In 6 months, I would discover paperwork that would turn our family's entire financial reality upside down. In 8 months, I would learn secrets about my biological father's estate that would redefine everything I thought I knew about my own inheritance rights. And in 12 months, I would be sitting across from Rick in that same conference room, holding documents that would give me control over his financial future in ways none of us could have imagined. But that Thursday afternoon, all I knew was that the education Rick had refused to support had led me to exactly where I needed to be. The girl he'd dismissed as not his blood had become the woman with the power to manage his blood legacy. And for the first time since that night in his kitchen, I felt like the universe might actually have a sense of justice after all. The following Monday morning brought an email that would change the trajectory of my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. David Kim forwarded me a message from the Oregon State Bar Association regarding an estate matter that required immediate attention. The subject line was stark and official. "Urgent, Hartwell Estate Administration, missing beneficiary located." I stared at the screen for several minutes, my coffee growing cold as I tried to process what I was reading. My father's last name had been Hartwell, but he died when I was 9, and my mother had assured me there were no assets to inherit, no estate to settle. She'd told me that my father had been young and hadn't thought about wills or life insurance, that his death had left us with nothing but memories and medical bills. The email requested my immediate presence at the law offices of Morrison, Keller and Associates to discuss recently discovered assets related to the estate of James Michael Hartwell, deceased 1997. It included a case number, a reference to something called the Eleanor Hartwell Memorial Trust, and a request that I bring identification and any documentation related to my father's death. My hands were shaking as I picked up my office phone to call the number listed in the email. A receptionist with a crisp professional voice answered on the second ring. "Morrison, Keller and Associates. How may I help you?" "This is Zoe Hartwell," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I received an email about an estate matter involving my father, James Hartwell. I'd like to schedule an appointment as soon as possible." "Oh yes, Miss Hartwell. We've been trying to locate you for quite some time. Mr. Morrison has a cancellation this afternoon at 2 o'clock if you're available. This is rather time-sensitive, so the sooner we can meet, the better." I confirmed the appointment and spent the rest of the morning in a strange fog, going through the motions of my regular work while my mind raced with questions. What assets could my father have had that I'd never known about? Why was this coming to light now, 15 years after his death? And why did the trust have my grandmother's name on it when I'd never even met Eleanor Hartwell? David noticed my distraction during our weekly case review meeting. "Everything all right? You seem preoccupied today." I explained about the email and the appointment, watching his expression shift from casual interest to professional concern. "That's unusual," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Estate matters don't typically surface 15 years after death, unless there was some kind of administrative error or deliberately concealed assets. Do you want me to come with you? Sometimes it helps to have another set of professional eyes on these situations." The offer was tempting, but something told me this was a conversation I needed to have alone first. Thank you, but I think I should handle the initial meeting myself. If it's complicated, I might take you up on that offer for follow-up meetings. The law offices of Morrison, Keller and Associates occupied the top 2 floors of a downtown Portland building that exuded old money respectability. The elevator opened into a reception area decorated with Persian rugs and oil paintings that probably cost more than my annual salary. This wasn't the kind of firm that handled small estate matters or simple wills. Mr. Morrison turned out to be a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of measured speaking style that suggested every word was carefully considered. His office overlooked Pioneer Courthouse Square, and the walls were lined with law books that looked like they'd been accumulating dust since the 1980s. "Ms. Hartwell," he said, rising from behind his massive oak desk to shake my hand. "Thank you for coming in so quickly. Please, have a seat. I have quite a bit to explain to you." He gestured to a leather chair across from his desk, then settled back into his own chair with a thick file folder that had my father's name written on the tab. The folder looked well worn, as if it had been opened and reviewed many times over the years. "Before we begin," he said, "I need to verify your identity and your relationship to James Michael Hartwell." He handed me a form requesting my social security number, birth certificate information, and details about my parents, marriage, and my father's death. As I filled out the paperwork, Mr. Morrison began explaining the situation in the careful, methodical way that lawyers use when they're about to deliver information that will fundamentally alter someone's understanding of their life. "Your father," he began, "was the sole heir to a substantial trust established by his mother, Eleanor Hartwell, in 1995. Eleanor was a remarkably successful businesswoman who built a chain of specialty manufacturing companies throughout the Pacific Northwest. When she died in 1996, she left everything to your father through what's called a generation-skipping trust." I looked up from the forms, my pen frozen mid-signature. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. My father worked construction. He was killed in a car accident when he was 28. He didn't have money, and I never met my grandmother." Mr. Morrison nodded sympathetically. "I understand this is surprising. Your father was indeed young when he inherited, and the trust was structured in a way that he couldn't access the principal until he turned 30. He was receiving monthly distributions of about $3,000, but the bulk of the estate, approximately $1.2 million in 1996, was held in trust until his 30th birthday. The numbers didn't make sense. $3,000 a month would have been significant money in the late 1990s, but I remembered us struggling financially, my mother working multiple jobs, the constant stress about bills and rent. "Where did that money go?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I knew the answer. "According to our records, the monthly distributions were sent to a joint account held by your father and your stepmother, Linda Hartwell Brennan. After your father's death, those distributions continued to be sent to the same account, as the trust specified that in the event of your father's death before age 30, the distributions would continue to his surviving spouse until you reached the age of majority." The words hit me like a physical blow. Linda Hartwell Brennan. My mother had been receiving money from my father's trust for years, money that should have supported my education and my future, money that she'd never mentioned while I was taking out student loans and working multiple jobs to pay for college. How much money are we talking about? My voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else. Mr. Morrison consulted his notes. The monthly distributions were $3,000 from 1997 until 2006, when you turned 18. That's approximately $324,000 over 9 years. Additionally, the principal of the trust has been growing through conservative investments. As of last month, the total value is approximately $2.8 million. I felt like the room was spinning. Nearly $3 million. My father had left me almost $3 million, and I'd never known it existed. My mother had been receiving $3,000 a month, money that could have paid for my college education several times over, while Rick was telling me he couldn't afford to help with tuition because I wasn't his blood. "Why am I just learning about this now?" I managed to ask. "That's where the situation becomes complicated," Mr. Morrison said, his expression growing more serious. The trust specified that you were to be informed of your inheritance on your 18th birthday and given full control at age 25. However, the notifications we sent to your last known address were returned as undeliverable. When we tried to contact your mother, we were told that you were no longer living at home and that she didn't have current contact information for you. The implications of what he was saying slowly sank in. My mother had lied to the law firm about my whereabouts, preventing me from learning about my inheritance when I legally should have been informed. She'd allowed me to struggle through college, to take on crushing debt, to feel abandoned by my family, all while sitting on knowledge of an inheritance that would have changed my entire life. We've been searching for you for the past several years, Mr. Morrison continued. It was only when you became professionally licensed in the financial services industry that our investigators were able to locate you through professional databases. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. The very career I'd built to overcome the financial struggles my family had imposed on me was what had finally led to the discovery of money that could have prevented those struggles in the first place. There's more, Mr. Morrison said gently. The trust also includes a clause regarding educational expenses. If you had known about the inheritance and used it for qualified educational expenses, those costs would have been reimbursed from the trust principal without affecting your future inheritance. Essentially, your college education should have been fully funded by your father's estate. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what I was learning. Not only had my father left me financially secure, but he'd specifically ensured that my education would be paid for. The $80,000 in student loans I was still paying off, the work-study jobs, the financial stress that had defined my college years, all of it had been unnecessary. What happens now? I asked, though my mind was already racing ahead to the confrontations that would inevitably follow. Now you claim your inheritance, Mr. Morrison said simply. The trust becomes yours to manage as you see fit. There will be some paperwork to complete, and we'll need to transfer the assets to accounts under your control. But legally, this money has belonged to you since your 25th birthday. He handed me a thick packet of documents, trust agreements, investment statements, and legal papers that represented a financial freedom I'd never dared to imagine. As I flipped through the pages, one section caught my attention, a detailed accounting of where the monthly distributions had been sent. The payments had indeed gone to a joint account held by my mother and father, and after his death, they'd continued going to that same account, which was now solely in my mother's name. But starting in 1999, additional transfers appeared, regular movements of money from my mother's account to something called Brennan Construction Family Account. My mother hadn't just hidden my inheritance from me, she'd been funneling the money to Rick's business accounts for years. The man who'd told me he couldn't afford to help with my college costs had been indirectly benefiting from my father's estate planning for my entire adolescence. Mr. Morrison, I said, pointing to the transfer records, are these what I think they are? He studied the pages I was indicating, then nodded grimly. It appears that the money your father intended for your support and education was being transferred to your stepfather's business accounts. This would likely constitute a breach of fiduciary duty on your mother's part, as she was essentially the trustee for your benefit until you reached majority. The legal implications were staggering. Not only had my mother concealed my inheritance, but she'd also been systematically transferring the money to Rick, essentially stealing from my father's estate to fund the lifestyle of the man who'd refused to support my education. What are my options? I asked, though I was beginning to understand that I had more power in this situation than I'd ever imagined. Several, Mr. Morrison said. You can simply claim your inheritance and move forward, which is certainly your right. You can also pursue legal action to recover the funds that were improperly transferred over the years. Given the amounts involved and the clear documentation of the transfers, you would have a strong case for recovering those funds with interest. I thought about Rick sitting in David's conference room just days earlier, discussing his estate planning needs, bragging about his construction business success, never knowing that much of that success had been built on money stolen from his stepdaughter's inheritance. I thought about my mother's guilty glances over the years, her inability to stand up to Rick when he refused to help with my education, her quiet acceptance of my financial struggles. I need some time to think about this, I said finally. Of course, Mr. Morrison replied, but I should mention one more thing. The trust includes a rather unusual clause that your grandmother inserted probably as a safeguard against exactly this kind of situation. If the inheritance is concealed from the beneficiary past their 25th birthday, control of the trust can be transferred to a professional fiduciary to prevent further mismanagement. He handed me one more document, and as I read through the legal language, I began to understand the full scope of what my grandmother had planned. Not only had she left me financially secure, but she'd also anticipated that family members might try to interfere with my inheritance. The clause he was referencing would allow me to place the entire trust under professional management, protecting it from any future family manipulation. The interesting thing about this clause, Mr. Morrison continued, is that once it's activated, the professional fiduciary has the authority to pursue recovery of any funds that were improperly distributed from the trust. It essentially gives you legal standing to reclaim everything that was taken without having to file the lawsuit yourself. The elegance of my grandmother's planning was breathtaking. She'd not only provided for my financial security but had also created a mechanism for me to recover from family betrayal, all while keeping my hands relatively clean of the legal messiness that would inevitably follow. I left the law office with a briefcase full of documents and a head full of possibilities. The walk back to my own office felt surreal, like I was moving through a world that had fundamentally shifted while looking exactly the same. The same downtown Portland streets, the same coffee shops and food trucks, but now I was walking through them as someone with nearly $3 million and the legal authority to reclaim years of stolen funds. Back at Pacific Northwest Trust Management, I found David in his office reviewing client files. He looked up when I knocked on his door frame, and his expression immediately shifted to concern when he saw my face. "How did the meeting go?" he asked, gesturing for me to take a seat. I spent the next hour explaining everything. The inheritance I'd never known existed, the money that had been hidden from me, the transfers to Rick's business accounts, and the legal mechanisms my grandmother had put in place to protect my interests. David listened with the focused attention he brought to complex client situations, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just letting me process the information out loud. "That's quite a development," he said when I finished. "And you're certain about the documentation? The transfers to your stepfather's accounts are clearly documented?" Mr. Morrison showed me bank records going back over a decade. "The paper trail is undeniable." David leaned back in his chair, clearly processing the implications. "You realize this puts you in a rather unique position regarding the Brennan family trust work we've been doing?" I hadn't even considered that angle yet, but he was right. Rick had come to our firm seeking estate planning advice, never knowing that his stepdaughter, whom he'd excluded from his own family's financial planning, was about to become one of the wealthiest individuals he knew. The cosmic justice of the situation was almost overwhelming. "What would you recommend?" I asked, genuinely curious about his professional perspective. Personally, I'd activate the professional fiduciary clause and let the legal system handle the recovery process. It protects you from having to be the bad guy while ensuring that justice is served. Professionally, as your employer, I should probably mention that this situation could complicate our work with the Brennan family accounts. "How so?" "Well, once they learn about your inheritance and the fund recovery process, they're likely to be quite upset. It might be awkward for you to continue managing their estate planning when you're simultaneously involved in legal action to recover money from them." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of us. Rick had specifically requested me as his trust officer, never imagining that I would soon have the financial resources and legal authority to hold him accountable for years of benefiting from stolen funds. "Actually," I said, an idea beginning to form, "I think I'd like to continue managing their accounts, at least until the inheritance situation is resolved. There's something poetic about using the professional skills they never thought I'd develop to oversee their family's financial planning." David raised an eyebrow. Quote, "That's bold and possibly brilliant. Just make sure you maintain complete professional standards throughout the process. If you're going to do this, you need to be absolutely above reproach." That evening, I sat in my apartment, with the inheritance documents spread across my dining table, trying to plan my next moves. The smart financial decision would be to activate the professional fiduciary clause immediately and let the lawyers handle everything while I focused on building my career. But there was something appealing about the idea of confronting my family directly, of seeing their faces when they realized the full scope of what they'd done. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "It was so nice to see you at the meeting last week. Maybe we could have lunch soon and catch up properly?" I stared at the message for a long time, wondering if she suspected that I'd learned about the inheritance, or if she genuinely thought she could continue the charade of being a loving mother who'd done her best in difficult circumstances. Part of me wanted to respond immediately, to confront her with everything I'd learned, but I knew that patience would serve me better. Instead, I typed back, "I'd like that. Let me check my schedule and get back to you." It was a holding pattern response, giving me time to plan while maintaining the illusion that our relationship might be returning to normal. In reality, I was already planning a confrontation that would reveal 15 years of lies and force my family to face the consequences of their actions. The next morning brought a call from Mr. Morrison with an update that would accelerate my timeline significantly. "Ms. Hartwell, I wanted to let you know that we've completed our investigation into the transferred funds. The total amount that was improperly moved from your trust to various Brennan family accounts is approximately $847,000, including interest and investment growth that should have occurred within the trust." The number was staggering. Nearly $1 million had been stolen from my inheritance and used to fund the lifestyle of people who'd treated me like an unwelcome burden. I thought about Rick's expensive suits at our recent meeting, the family vacations I'd never been invited to join, Tyler's college education that had been fully funded while mine had been dismissed as an impossible luxury. "What's our timeline for recovery?" I asked. "If you activate the professional fiduciary clause, we can begin proceedings immediately. The documentation is clear enough that we would expect full recovery within 6 to 8 months, possibly sooner if the defendants choose to settle rather than face a lengthy legal battle. And if I wanted to confront them directly before starting the legal process?" "That's certainly your right, though I'd caution you to be careful about any agreements or compromises you might be tempted to make. The amount of money involved is significant enough that it deserves proper legal handling." I thanked him and hung up, then sat staring out my office window at the Portland skyline. In the distance, I could see the construction cranes that were reshaping the city's profile, and I couldn't help but think about Rick's construction business, built partially on money stolen from my father's estate. The symbolism felt too perfect to ignore. David knocked on my office door around noon, interrupting my contemplation with news that would force my hand sooner than I'd expected. "The Brennan family just called," he said. "They want to schedule a follow-up meeting to finalize their trust structures. They specifically requested you as their trust officer, and they'd like to meet tomorrow afternoon if possible." The timing felt like fate. Rick was asking me to manage his family's financial future at the exact moment I was preparing to reclaim the money he'd stolen from my own financial future. The opportunity to confront him in a professional setting surrounded by legal documents and fiduciary responsibilities was too perfect to pass up. "Schedule the meeting," I said. "And, David, I think tomorrow afternoon might be a good time to activate that professional fiduciary clause we discussed." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation. I spent the morning with Mr. Morrison, signing the paperwork that would trigger the inheritance recovery process and officially place me in control of my father's estate. By noon, I was the beneficiary of a $2.8 million trust and the party to a legal action that would recover nearly another $1 million in stolen funds. The afternoon meeting with the Brennan family was scheduled for 2 o'clock, and I arrived at the office early to review their files and prepare for what would likely be the most challenging professional interaction of my career. David had offered to sit in on the meeting for support, but I declined. This was something I needed to handle alone. At exactly 2 o'clock, Rick, my mother, and Tyler arrived at our offices, looking relaxed and optimistic about finalizing their estate planning. They settled into the conference room chairs with the comfortable confidence of people who believed they controlled the narrative of their family's financial future. "Before we begin discussing your trust structures," I said, arranging my papers with deliberate care, "I have some information that might affect your estate planning decisions." I handed Rick a copy of the inheritance documents Mr. Morrison had provided, watching his face carefully as he read through the legal language describing my father's estate and the monthly distributions that had been sent to my mother for nearly a decade. The color drained from his face as he processed what he was reading. My mother's hands flew to her mouth and Tyler looked back and forth between us with growing confusion. "I don't understand. Rick said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. What is this? This, I said calmly, is documentation of the inheritance my father left me, along with records of where that money went after his death. As you can see, the monthly distributions that were intended for my education and support were transferred to your business accounts for years. The silence in the room was deafening. Rick stared at the documents like they might disappear if he looked at them hard enough, while my mother seemed to be having trouble breathing. Zoe, my mother said finally, I can explain. I'm sure you can, I interrupted gently. But right now, I'm more interested in discussing how this affects your family's estate planning needs. I turned to Rick with the same professional demeanor I'd maintained throughout our previous meetings. Given that you've benefited substantially from my father's estate over the years, you might want to consider how the recovery of those funds will impact your own financial planning. Rick's jaw worked silently as he struggled to find words. The man who'd spent years dismissing me as unworthy of financial support was slowly realizing that I had not only achieved financial independence without his help, but that I now had the legal authority to reclaim money he'd been using to build his own wealth. How much? He asked finally. Approximately $847,000 plus interest and penalties, I said matter-of-factly. The legal proceedings began this morning. The number hit the room like a physical force. Tyler's eyes widened as he began to understand the scope of what was happening, while my mother looked like she might faint. Rick's hands trembled as he set down the documents, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. But I didn't know. He started, then stopped, clearly realizing that ignorance wasn't a defense for benefiting from stolen funds. I'm sure the court will be interested in your perspective during the recovery proceedings, I said. But for now, shall we discuss your trust management needs? I believe you are interested in establishing structures to protect your family's wealth for future generations. The cruel irony of the situation was perfect. Rick had come to me seeking professional help to protect and manage his family's money, never knowing that I was about to reclaim a significant portion of that money through legal action. He was asking the person he'd financially excluded to help him plan for a financial future that would be dramatically altered by the consequences of that exclusion. I think, Rick said slowly, we might need to postpone our estate planning until we have a better understanding of our current financial situation. Of course, I replied with professional sympathy. Major financial changes do require careful consideration. Feel free to call us when you're ready to proceed. As the Brennan family gathered their things and prepared to leave, Rick paused at the conference room door. For a moment, he looked like he might say something. An apology, an explanation, an acknowledgement of the cosmic justice that had brought us to this moment. Instead, he just shook his head and walked out, followed by my mother and Tyler. I sat alone in the conference room for several minutes after they left, processing what had just happened. The confrontation had been professionally satisfying and personally vindicating, but it had also marked the definitive end of any pretense of family relationship with the people who'd raised me. David appeared in the doorway, having clearly heard enough of the conversation to understand the significance of what had transpired. How do you feel? He asked. I considered the question carefully. How did I feel? Vindicated, certainly. Financially secure, in a way I'd never imagined possible. Professionally accomplished in a field that Rick had dismissed as impractical. But also strangely empty, like I'd won a game that I'd never really wanted to play. I feel free, I said finally. For the first time in my life, I feel completely free. And it was true. The money was life-changing. But more important was the knowledge that I no longer needed anything from the people who'd spent years making me feel like I wasn't enough. I had my father's financial legacy, my grandmother's protective planning, and my own professional competence. I had everything I needed to build whatever life I wanted, without reference to the opinions or approval of people who'd never really seen my value. The phone on the conference table rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Mr. Morrison with an update that would add one more layer of poetic justice to the day's revelations. Ms. Hartwell, he said, I have some interesting news. The Brennan family's attorney just contacted us requesting information about potential settlement negotiations. It seems they're hoping to resolve this matter quickly and quietly. What kind of settlement are they proposing? Full restitution plus interest, which would actually exceed our original recovery target. They're also requesting confidentiality agreements to prevent public disclosure of the situation. The irony was perfect. The family that had spent years claiming they couldn't afford to help with my education was now scrambling to pay nearly $1 million to avoid the public embarrassment of having their financial manipulation exposed. They had the money, they'd always had the money. They just hadn't wanted to spend it on me. "What would you recommend?" I asked. "Financially, the settlement offer is excellent. You'd recover everything that was taken, plus additional compensation. Personally, you'd avoid the stress and uncertainty of a prolonged legal battle. The only question is whether you feel the need for public vindication or if private justice is sufficient." I thought about my options. Public exposure would certainly be satisfying, and it might prevent Rick and my mother from manipulating other family members in the future. But it would also tie me to their drama for months or years, keeping me connected to people I was ready to leave behind permanently. "I'll take the settlement," I said. "But I want one modification to the confidentiality agreement." "What's that?" "They can't prevent me from helping other people who might be in similar situations. If someone else is dealing with concealed inheritances or family financial manipulation, I want to be able to share my experience and resources." "That seems reasonable. We can structure the agreement to allow you to discuss your general experience while protecting the specific details of their situation." Within a week, the settlement was finalized. Nearly $1 million was transferred to accounts under my control, bringing my total inherited wealth to almost $4 million. More importantly, I had established my independence from a family system that had never truly valued me and created the financial foundation to help others who might face similar challenges. But even as I celebrated this victory, I had no idea that the inheritance recovery was just the beginning. In the coming months, I would discover additional family secrets that would challenge everything I thought I knew about loyalty, justice, and the complex relationships between money and power. The woman who'd been dismissed as not worth a college investment was about to become one of the most influential people in her former family's financial future, and the implications of that shift would reshape all of our lives in ways none of us could have predicted. 6 months after the settlement, my life had transformed in ways that went far beyond the numbers in my bank account. The nearly $4 million certainly provided security I'd never known, but more significant was the professional reputation I'd built and the unexpected direction my career had taken. Word had somehow spread through Portland's financial community about my expertise in inheritance recovery and family wealth disputes, despite the confidentiality agreements surrounding my own case. It started with a phone call from a woman named Catherine Walsh, whose voice trembled as she explained that she'd heard I might be able to help with a complicated family trust situation. She'd gotten my name from Mr. Morrison, who had apparently been fielding similar inquiries from other attorneys dealing with inheritance disputes. "I know this might sound strange," Catherine said during our initial consultation, "but I think my stepfather has been stealing from my grandmother's estate for 20 years. The problem is, he's also the executor, and every time I ask questions, he tells me I'm being greedy and ungrateful." The story was achingly familiar. Catherine's grandmother had left a substantial estate intended to support her education and early career, but the stepfather who'd married into the family had somehow convinced everyone that the money was being properly managed, while Catherine struggled with student loans and entry-level jobs. The parallels to my own experience were unmistakable. "Have you seen any documentation of the estate's assets or distributions?" I asked, already knowing the answer from the defeated tone in her voice. "He says the paperwork is too complicated for me to understand, and that questioning his management shows a lack of trust in family. My mother always takes his side, says I should be grateful for what I have instead of obsessing over money that might not even exist." I spent 2 hours with Catherine that afternoon, walking her through the same investigative process that had uncovered my own inheritance. We requested estate records from the probate court, contacted the original attorney who'd handled her grandmother's will, and discovered financial institutions that had been managing trust assets for decades. Within a week, we'd uncovered evidence of systematic mismanagement that had cost Catherine nearly $300,000 in rightful inheritance. The case became the first official engagement for what I was beginning to think of as my inheritance recovery practice. Working with Mr. Morrison's firm as legal counsel, I developed a systematic approach for investigating concealed or mismanaged family wealth, combining my trust management expertise with investigative techniques I'd learned through my own experience. David Kim had initially been skeptical about my expanding focus on inheritance disputes. concerned that it might distract from my regular trust officer duties at Pacific Northwest Trust Management. But as more clients began requesting my services specifically for complex family wealth situations, he recognized the business opportunity we were creating. "You've essentially invented a new practice area," he told me during our quarterly review meeting. "There's clearly demand for someone who understands both the technical aspects of trust management and the family dynamics that complicate these situations. Have you considered making this your primary focus?" The suggestion was intriguing but also intimidating. Building a specialized practice would mean taking significant professional risks, potentially leaving the security of my current position to pursue something that didn't have an established market or predictable income stream. On the other hand, the work felt more meaningful than traditional wealth management, helping people reclaim financial resources that had been unfairly withheld from them. "What would that look like practically?" I asked. "We could restructure your role here to focus primarily on complex inheritance and family dispute cases. You'd still be affiliated with Pacific Northwest Trust Management, but you'd have more autonomy to develop your own client base and set your own fee structure. Think of it as a partnership track position with a specialty focus." The proposal was exactly the kind of professional recognition I'd dreamed about during those years of working multiple jobs to pay for college. More than that, it was an opportunity to turn my own painful experience into a tool for helping others navigate similar challenges. I spent the weekend considering David's offer, walking through the Pearl District neighborhoods where I'd built my independent life, thinking about the trajectory that had brought me from Rick's kitchen dismissal to this moment of professional opportunity. The irony wasn't lost on me that the inheritance recovery work was essentially a more sophisticated version of what I'd been doing in the university's financial aid office, helping people understand complex financial systems and advocating for resources they deserved but hadn't been able to access. Monday morning brought my decision and a phone call that would test my new professional focus in ways I hadn't anticipated. I accepted David's offer to restructure my role, and less than an hour later, my assistant transferred a call from someone whose name made my stomach drop. "Miss Hartwell? This is Tyler Brennan. I think we need to talk." My stepbrother's voice was strained, lacking the casual confidence I remembered from our recent encounter in the trust office. I hadn't spoken to any member of the Brennan family since the settlement had been finalized, and I'd assumed our business was permanently concluded. "Hello, Tyler," I said carefully. "What can I help you with?" "It's about my father, and some things I found in his office that I think you should know about. Could we meet somewhere private? This isn't something I can discuss over the phone." The request was unexpected and potentially complicated. Whatever Tyler had discovered, it clearly involved Rick and had some connection to my inheritance situation. My first instinct was to decline, to maintain the professional distance I'd established with my former family. But something in Tyler's tone suggested this wasn't a casual attempt to rebuild family relationships. "I can meet you for coffee tomorrow afternoon," I said finally. "But I should mention that any information you share with me might be subject to professional reporting requirements, depending on what it involves." We arranged to meet at a small cafe in Southeast Portland, far from both our offices and the neighborhoods where we'd grown up. I spent the evening wondering what Tyler might have found and whether I was making a mistake by agreeing to see him. The next afternoon, Tyler was already waiting when I arrived at the cafe, sitting in a corner booth with a manila envelope, and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd been rehearsing this conversation for days. He looked older than I remembered, more serious, like he'd been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about his family. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as I sat down across from him. "I wasn't sure you would, given everything that's happened. What's this about, Tyler?" He pushed the manila envelope across the table. "I found these papers in Dad's office last week. I was helping him organize files for an insurance audit, and I came across a folder marked Hartwell Estate Confidential. I probably shouldn't have looked, but when I saw your father's name, I opened the envelope and found myself looking at documents I'd never seen before, including what appeared to be original copies of my father's will and trust agreements. But these weren't the same versions Mr. Morrison had shown me. These documents included additional pages, amendments, and notations that significantly changed the scope of my inheritance." "Tyler, where exactly did you find these?" "In Dad's personal safe, along with a bunch of other paperwork that goes back to when he first married your mom. There's more stuff, but this seemed like the most important. I studied the documents more carefully, my heart rate increasing as I began to understand what I was looking at. The trust agreement in Tyler's envelope included provisions I'd never heard about, additional assets that hadn't been mentioned in the official estate proceedings, and most significantly, a clause that made Rick himself a potential beneficiary under certain circumstances. According to these documents, my father's trust hadn't just provided monthly distributions to my mother after his death. It had also included a provision that if my mother remarried, her new spouse would become a co-trustee with authority to make investment decisions for the trust assets. Rick hadn't just been passively receiving money that was transferred to his accounts, he'd actually been legally authorized to manage my inheritance for years. But that wasn't the most shocking revelation. The final page of the trust agreement included an amendment dated just months before my father's death, adding a clause that would transfer a substantial portion of the trust assets to any children Rick might have if I failed to claim my inheritance by age 30. Tyler wasn't just Rick's son. Under the terms of this amendment, he was potentially entitled to hundreds of thousands of dollars from my father's estate. "Did you know about this?" I asked, holding up the amendment. Tyler shook his head, his expression genuinely confused. "I had no idea any of this existed until I found those papers. Dad never mentioned your father's money, and I always assumed the college fund he set up for me came from his construction business." The implications were staggering. Rick hadn't just hidden my inheritance from me. He'd actively positioned himself and his son to benefit from it if I remained unaware of my rights. The monthly distributions he'd been receiving weren't theft in the traditional sense. They were payments he was legally entitled to receive as co-trustee. But his failure to inform me of my inheritance rights when I turned 18 was a deliberate breach of his fiduciary duty, designed to ensure that I would miss the deadline for claiming my full inheritance. "Tyler, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did your father ever discuss the terms under which you might inherit additional money beyond what he'd saved from his business?" Tyler was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking back through years of conversations. "There was something," he said finally. "When I was in college, Dad mentioned that there might be some additional family money available when I turned 30, something about trust structures and estate planning. He said it was complicated, and that I shouldn't worry about it until the time came." The picture was becoming clearer. Rick had planned to let me remain ignorant of my inheritance until I reached 30, at which point the amendment would have transferred a significant portion of my father's estate to Tyler. It was a long-term strategy designed to redirect my inheritance to Rick's biological son while maintaining plausible deniability about his actions. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked Tyler. "According to these documents, you could have been entitled to hundreds of thousands of dollars if I'd never found out about the trust." Tyler looked genuinely uncomfortable with the question. "Because it's not right," he said finally. "Your dad died when you were 9 years old. He left that money for you, not for us. Finding out that my college education was paid for with money that should have gone to your college education, it makes me sick." His response surprised me. I'd expected Tyler to defend his father's actions, or to argue that he'd received the money in good faith. Instead, he seemed genuinely disturbed by the discovery of how our family's finances had been structured. "What do you want to happen now?" I asked. "I want to make it right," Tyler said. "I've been doing some research since I found these papers. The amendment that would have given me part of your inheritance was signed without your knowledge or consent, and probably without proper legal authority. I think it should be voided, and I think you should get everything that was originally intended for you." The conversation was taking a direction I hadn't expected. Tyler wasn't trying to claim his potential inheritance or to defend his father's actions. Instead, he was volunteering to give up financial benefits he might have been entitled to in order to ensure that I received what my father had intended for me. "Tyler, you realize that voiding this amendment could cost you several $100,000? "Money I never knew I was supposed to have," he replied. "Money that came from your dad's death. I can't live with that." We spent the next hour going through the documents in detail, and with each page, the scope of Rick's deception became clearer. He hadn't just hidden my inheritance. He'd systematically restructured it to benefit his own family while creating legal cover for his actions. The trust modifications, the co-trustee arrangements, the amendment adding Tyler as a beneficiary, It all represented a coordinated effort to redirect my father's estate planning to serve Rick's family instead of mine. But Tyler's willingness to expose these arrangements and forfeit his potential inheritance was creating an opportunity for complete justice that I hadn't thought possible. With his cooperation, I could challenge not just the original theft of monthly distributions, but the entire structure Rick had created to benefit from my father's death. "What happens if we take this to the lawyers?" Tyler asked. "Honestly, it probably means your father faces serious legal consequences. Breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, possibly criminal charges depending on how the courts interpret his actions. It also means your family's finances get scrutinized in ways that could be very uncomfortable." Tyler nodded slowly. He made his choices. I can't protect him from the consequences of something this wrong. The next morning, I was back in Mr. Morrison's office with Tyler and the additional documents. Watching the attorney's expression grow increasingly serious as he reviewed the papers Tyler had found. "This is quite remarkable," Mr. Morrison said finally. Mr. Brennan essentially created a parallel estate plan that would have allowed him to legally claim much of your father's assets while maintaining the appearance of proper trust management. The sophistication of the scheme suggests he had professional legal help in structuring these arrangements. "What are our options?" I asked. "Several, and all of them are favorable to you." The amendment adding Tyler as a beneficiary was signed without your knowledge and without proper disclosure of the conflict of interest, which makes it legally invalid. The co-trustee arrangement was similarly compromised by Mr. Brennan's failure to inform you of your rights when you reached majority. We can void all of these modifications and restore the original trust terms. "What does that mean financially?" Mr. Morrison consulted his notes. "In addition to the settlement you've already received, you would be entitled to approximately another $600,000 in assets that were redirected through these invalid amendments. You would also have grounds for additional damages based on the investment growth those assets should have experienced if they'd remained in the original trust. The total recovery was approaching $2 million beyond my original inheritance. But more important than the money was the validation that my father's original intentions would finally be honored, and that Rick's manipulation of the legal system would be completely reversed." Tyler spent the rest of the meeting signing documents that formally renounced any claim to my father's estate and authorized the legal action needed to void Rick's amendments. His cooperation was crucial to the case, and his willingness to sacrifice potential inheritance for the sake of justice was something I hadn't expected from someone who'd grown up in Rick's household. "Why are you doing this?" I asked him as we left the law office together. "Because I finally understand what kind of man my father really is," Tyler said. "And I don't want to be that kind of man myself." The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Rick's modifications to my father's trust were voided, the assets he'd redirected were recovered with interest, and additional penalties were imposed for his breach of fiduciary duty. More significantly, the court's findings made it clear that Rick's actions constituted a systematic effort to defraud a minor of her inheritance, which carried both civil and criminal implications. But even as I celebrated this more complete victory, I was beginning to understand that my inheritance recovery work was attracting attention from people who had their own complicated relationships with family wealth and power. The phone calls were becoming more frequent, the cases more complex, and the amounts of money involved were growing steadily larger. One case in particular would challenge everything I thought I understood about justice, loyalty, and the corrupting influence of wealth. It would involve a family even more dysfunctional than my own, assets that dwarfed my father's inheritance, and a client whose motives were far more complicated than Catherine Walsh's straightforward desire for justice. The call came on a Friday afternoon in late October, just as I was preparing to leave the office for the weekend. My assistant had already gone home, and I almost let the call go to voicemail, but something made me pick up on the final ring. "Ms. Hartwell, my name is Victoria Ashford. I believe you've developed something of a specialty in complex inheritance disputes." The name Ashford was familiar from Portland's social pages and business journals. The Ashford family owned a significant portion of the commercial real estate in downtown Portland, along with investments in technology companies and sustainable energy projects. They were the kind of old money family that appeared at charity galas and museum board meetings, wielding influence that was both substantial and largely invisible. I have experience with inheritance recovery and family trust disputes, I said carefully. What kind of situation are you dealing with? The kind that could destroy several prominent families if it becomes public, Victoria said. And the kind that involves enough money to make your previous cases look like small claims disputes. Could we meet next week? I think you'll find my situation quite interesting. The conversation lasted only a few more minutes, but Victoria's tone and the implications of what she was suggesting stayed with me through the weekend. The Ashford family's wealth was generational, the kind of money that shaped political decisions and influenced economic development throughout the Pacific Northwest. If Victoria was dealing with inheritance disputes involving that level of assets, the case would be unlike anything I'd handled before. More concerning was her comment about destroying prominent families. My experience had taught me that family wealth disputes were rarely contained to a single family, especially when the amounts involved were substantial enough to affect business partnerships, charitable foundations, and political relationships. Monday morning brought a meeting that would introduce me to a level of family dysfunction and financial manipulation that made Rick's deception look like amateur hour. Victoria Ashford arrived at my office precisely on time, dressed in the kind of understated elegance that only comes with generational wealth, and accompanied by a legal team that probably cost more per hour than most people earned in a month. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of poise that suggested she'd been navigating complex social and business situations since childhood. But there was something in her eyes that reminded me of my own expression during those early meetings with Mr. Morrison, the look of someone who'd discovered that their family's reality was far different from what they'd been told. "Miss Hartwell," she said as we settled into my conference room, "I've been following your work with inheritance recovery, and I believe you may be the only person in Portland qualified to handle my family's situation." Quote, "What kind of situation are we discussing?" Victoria opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a document that immediately caught my attention. It was a private investigator's report, dated just 2 weeks earlier, with the kind of detailed financial analysis that suggested someone had spent considerable resources uncovering hidden assets. 3 months ago, my grandfather died. Victoria began. Marcus Ashford was 91 years old and had been the head of our family's business interests for over 50 years. According to his will, he left approximately $40 million to be divided among his children and grandchildren. The amount was staggering, but Victoria's tone suggested this was just the beginning of the story. The problem is that our family's actual assets are worth approximately $200 million. Someone has been systematically hiding wealth from the estate proceedings, and I believe that someone is my uncle, who has been managing our family's finances for the past decade. The parallels to my own experience were obvious, but the scale was almost incomprehensible. Victoria was describing theft that amounted to over $100 million, involving multiple companies, investment funds, and real estate holdings throughout the Pacific Northwest. "What evidence do you have?" I asked. Victoria handed me the investigator's report, which detailed a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and trust structures that had been used to hide assets from estate proceedings. The sophistication of the scheme was remarkable, involving multiple lawyers, accountants, and financial institutions in what appeared to be a coordinated effort to redirect generational wealth. "The most disturbing part," Victoria continued, "is that this has been going on for years. My grandfather thought he was worth $40 million when he died, but he actually controlled assets worth 5 times that amount. My uncle convinced him that the family's investments were underperforming when they were actually generating substantial returns that were being diverted to accounts my grandfather never knew existed." As I read through the investigator's findings, I began to understand that Victoria's case would require not just inheritance recovery expertise, but also the kind of forensic financial analysis typically associated with major corporate fraud investigations. The amounts involved would attract federal attention, and the publicity could indeed destroy multiple prominent families if the case became public. "What's your goal in pursuing this?" I asked. "Justice," Victoria said simply, "and ensuring that my grandfather's true intentions are honored. He wanted to leave his wealth to family members and charitable causes. Instead, It's been stolen by someone who convinced him to trust their financial management. The meeting lasted 3 hours, and by the end I understood that accepting Victoria's case would represent a significant escalation in both the complexity and the stakes of my inheritance recovery practice. The case would require coordinating with federal investigators, managing media attention, and navigating political implications that could affect business relationships throughout Portland. But it would also represent the kind of professional challenge that could establish my reputation as the premier specialist in complex inheritance disputes, potentially leading to opportunities that would reshape my entire career trajectory. As Victoria and her legal team prepared to leave, she paused at my office door with a question that would prove more prescient than either of us realized at the time. "Ms. Hartwell, have you ever considered what happens when someone with your background and expertise becomes wealthy enough to influence the same kind of power structures that originally excluded them?" The question stayed with me long after she left, and would ultimately force me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own relationship with wealth, power, and the desire for justice that had driven my professional choices. The girl who'd been denied college funding because she wasn't blood family was about to become one of the most powerful people in Portland's financial community, and the implications of that transformation would test everything I thought I knew about myself and my values. The Victoria Ashford case consumed my life for the next 8 months, transforming my small inheritance recovery practice into something resembling a major forensic accounting operation. What had started as a family dispute over hidden assets evolved into a federal investigation involving the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, the IRS, and regulatory agencies I'd never heard of before accepting the case. Working with Victoria's team required me to develop expertise in areas far beyond traditional trust management. I found myself learning about international banking regulations, shell company structures, and cryptocurrency transactions that had been used to hide assets across multiple jurisdictions. The complexity was both intellectually stimulating and professionally terrifying, as every decision carried implications that could affect not just my client, but entire sectors of Portland's business community. The breakthrough came in March, when our forensic accountants discovered a pattern of transactions that connected Victoria's uncle's shell companies to a network of real estate investments throughout the Pacific Northwest. The investments weren't just hiding Ashford family assets. They were also connected to development projects involving several other prominent Portland families, including businesses that had partnerships with Rick's construction company. "This is bigger than we initially thought," Victoria said during one of our weekly strategy meetings. "The investigation isn't just about my family's stolen inheritance anymore. It's about systematic fraud that's been affecting multiple families and businesses for years." The revelation that Rick might be peripherally involved in the broader network we were investigating created a professional and personal dilemma I hadn't anticipated. My expertise in inheritance recovery had led me to a case that could potentially expose additional wrongdoing by my stepfather, beyond the theft of my own inheritance. The cosmic justice was almost too perfect, but it also raised questions about conflicts of interest and whether my personal history might compromise my professional judgment. I discussed the situation with David Kim, who had become both a mentor and a sounding board for the increasingly complex ethical issues arising from my specialized practice. "The connection to Rick Brennan is concerning," David said, reviewing the financial documents that linked his construction business to the broader fraud network. "Not because it affects your ability to do the work, but because it could become a media story that overshadows the actual investigation." "What do you mean?" "Think about the narrative. Local woman discovers she's inherited millions, exposes family theft, builds successful practice recovering other people's inheritances, then uncovers massive fraud network that includes her own stepfather. It's the kind of story that would dominate local news for months and potentially compromise the federal investigation." David's concern was legitimate, but it also highlighted how much my professional situation had changed since I'd first learned about my father's inheritance. I was no longer just someone seeking justice for personal wrongs. I had become a key figure in investigations that could reshape Portland's business community and affect the financial security of hundreds of families. The media attention began in April, when a business journalist from the Oregonian published an article about unusual patterns in commercial real estate transactions throughout downtown Portland. The article didn't mention the Ashford investigation specifically, but it cited anonymous sources discussing federal interest in certain development projects and their financing structures. Within a week, my office was receiving calls from reporters, investment advisors, and attorneys representing clients who were suddenly concerned about their own financial arrangements. The inheritance recovery work that had once felt like a niche specialty was becoming a matter of public interest, with implications that extended far beyond individual family disputes. Ms. Hartwell, said the reporter who managed to reach me directly despite my assistant's efforts to screen calls, I'm working on a story about inheritance fraud in Portland's business community. I understand you've developed expertise in this area and have been involved in some significant cases recently. The conversation was professionally polite, but clearly aimed at getting me to comment on investigations that were still ongoing. I declined to provide specific information, but the call made it clear that my work was no longer operating under the radar of public attention. More concerning were the calls from lawyers representing people who claimed to have information about additional cases of inheritance fraud or family financial manipulation. These weren't potential clients seeking help. They were intermediaries suggesting that my investigation work had uncovered information that could be valuable to other ongoing legal proceedings. Some of these calls feel more like fishing expeditions than legitimate legal inquiries. I told Victoria during our next meeting. I'm starting to think that our investigation has made some people very nervous about their own financial arrangements. Victoria nodded grimly. My uncle's lawyer contacted me yesterday. They're proposing a settlement that would resolve our family's case without admitting wrongdoing, but they also want guarantees that the information we've uncovered won't be shared with other investigators. The settlement offer was substantial, potentially recovering most of the hidden assets, while avoiding the uncertainty and publicity of a prolonged legal battle. But the proposed confidentiality agreements would prevent us from sharing information that could help other families recover their own stolen inheritances or assist federal investigators in building cases against other perpetrators. What's your instinct? I asked Victoria. I think they're scared, she said. Not just about our case, but about what else might be discovered if this investigation continues. The settlement offer feels less like a resolution and more like hush money. The ethical complexity of the situation was exactly the kind of challenge I'd never anticipated when I first started helping Catherine Walsh recover her grandmother's estate. Success in inheritance recovery work was creating opportunities to expose broader patterns of financial fraud, but it was also generating pressure to accept settlements that would limit the scope of justice for other victims. That weekend, I received a call that would clarify my thinking about these competing priorities in ways I hadn't expected. The caller was my mother, and her voice carried a level of stress I hadn't heard since the months immediately after my father's death. "Zoe," she said, "we need to talk. There are some things happening with Rick's business that I think you should know about." The request for a meeting was unprecedented. My mother had maintained complete silence about family matters since the settlement of my inheritance case, and I'd assumed that our relationship would remain permanently distant. Her sudden desire to communicate suggested that something significant had changed in the Brennan family situation. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Lake Oswego, neutral territory that was far from both our homes and workplaces. When I arrived, my mother was already waiting, looking older and more fragile than I remembered. The confident woman who'd stood by Rick's side during our trust office meetings had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely frightened. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. "I wasn't sure you would, given everything that's happened between us." "What's going on, Mom?" She handed me a manila envelope, similar to the one Tyler had brought to our meeting months earlier. "Rick doesn't know I have these," she said quietly. "I found them in his office last week, and I think they're connected to the investigation you're working on." The documents inside were financial records showing transactions between Rick's construction company and several of the shell companies we'd identified in the Ashford investigation. But these weren't just business partnerships. They were evidence that Rick had been actively laundering money through construction projects, using his legitimate business to hide the sources of funds that had been stolen from multiple family trusts. "Mom, how long have you known about this?" "I didn't know," she said, and I could hear the genuine distress in her voice. "I mean, I knew Rick's business was doing well, better than it should have been based on the contracts I knew about. But I thought maybe he was just good at finding profitable projects." The financial records painted a different picture. Rick's construction company had been receiving payments from investment funds that were connected to the broader fraud network, essentially serving as a money laundering operation disguised as legitimate business activity. The profits from these arrangements had funded the lifestyle improvements I'd noticed in recent years: the expensive suits, the larger house, the family vacations to destinations that should have been beyond his legitimate income. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. My mother was quiet for a long moment, staring at her coffee cup like it might provide answers to questions she didn't want to ask. "Because Tyler told me what you're doing with your work, helping families recover money that was stolen from them. And because I realized that Rick has been stealing from more than just your father's estate." She handed me one more document, a bank statement showing transfers from accounts associated with the Ashford investigation to Rick's personal accounts. The amounts were substantial, representing hundreds of thousands of dollars that had been diverted from legitimate family trusts to fund Rick's lifestyle and business expansion. "He's been lying to me for years," my mother said quietly, "about the business, about our finances, about where the money was really coming from. I thought I was married to a successful contractor, but I'm actually married to someone who's been stealing from families for decades." The revelation that my mother was finally acknowledging Rick's pattern of financial manipulation was both validating and deeply sad. She'd spent years enabling his behavior, either through willful ignorance or active participation, and now she was confronting the reality that her comfortable lifestyle had been built on systematic theft from vulnerable families. "What do you want to happen now?" I asked. "I want to help," she said simply. "I want to help you recover the money that Rick stole, not just from your father's estate, but from all the other families he's hurt. I have access to his records, and I know where he keeps documents that could be important to your investigation." The offer was both professionally valuable and personally complicated. My mother's cooperation could provide evidence that would strengthen our case against the broader fraud network, but it would also mean working closely with someone who had enabled my stepfather's theft for years. More significantly, her willingness to cooperate would likely mean the end of her marriage to Rick and the destruction of the life she'd built with him. She was essentially offering to sacrifice her own financial security to ensure that justice was served for the families Rick had victimized. "Mom, you understand that cooperating with this investigation will probably mean divorce proceedings, criminal charges against Rick, and the loss of most of the assets you've accumulated during your marriage?" "I understand," she said, "but I can't live with knowing that our money came from stealing from families like yours. I should have stopped it when I first found out about your father's estate, but I was too scared of losing everything. Now I'm more scared of living with the guilt." The next week brought a series of meetings with federal investigators, Victoria's legal team, and prosecutors who were building cases against multiple members of the fraud network. My mother's cooperation provided evidence that connected Rick's construction business to money laundering activities spanning over a decade, involving millions of dollars in stolen inheritance funds. The investigation had evolved far beyond a simple inheritance recovery case into a major federal prosecution targeting organized financial fraud. Rick wasn't just a small-time thief who'd stolen from his stepdaughter's trust. He was a key participant in a criminal enterprise that had systematically targeted wealthy families throughout the Pacific Northwest. "This changes everything," Victoria said during a meeting with our expanded legal team. "We're not just recovering my family's assets anymore, we're building a case that could take down an entire network of inheritance thieves and money launderers." The scope of the investigation was both exciting and overwhelming. Success would mean justice for dozens of families who'd been victimized by systematic theft. But it would also mean months or years of testimony, media attention, and legal proceedings that would dominate my professional life. More personally, it meant that my relationship with Rick would shift from a settled civil dispute to active cooperation in his criminal prosecution. The stepfather who'd refused to pay for my college education because I wasn't his blood was about to face federal charges based partly on evidence I'd helped uncover and testimony I would provide. The irony was perfect, but it was also sobering. The girl who'd been dismissed as unworthy of family investment had become a key figure in dismantling the criminal network that had funded her stepfather's lifestyle. The education he'd refused to support had given me the expertise needed to expose his crimes and ensure his prosecution. In June, the first round of indictments was unsealed, charging 17 people with conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud, money laundering, and related financial crimes. Rick's name was prominently featured among the defendants, along with Victoria's uncle and several other prominent business figures I recognized from Portland's social and political circles. The media coverage was extensive, with local and national news outlets describing the case as one of the largest inheritance fraud prosecutions in Pacific Northwest history. My name appeared in several articles as a key witness and inheritance recovery specialist, establishing my reputation as an expert in this emerging field, while also making me a public figure in ways I hadn't anticipated. The morning the indictments were announced, I received a call from Tyler that would add one more layer of complexity to the already complicated family dynamics surrounding the case. "Zoe," he said, "I wanted you to hear this from me before you saw it in the news. I'm going to testify against my father." Tyler's decision to cooperate with prosecutors wasn't entirely surprising, given his previous willingness to expose Rick's manipulation of my inheritance. But testifying in a criminal trial would mean publicly condemning his father's actions and potentially helping to send him to prison for years. "Are you sure about this?" I asked. "I've been thinking about it for months," Tyler said. "What my father did wasn't just wrong, it was criminal. And if I don't testify, other families might not get justice for what he stole from them." Tyler's cooperation would make the prosecution's case even stronger, but it would also destroy what remained of his relationship with Rick and potentially affect his relationship with our mother. He was choosing justice over family loyalty, just as I had done when I first decided to pursue my inheritance recovery. The trial was scheduled to begin in September, giving us several months to prepare testimony and organize evidence. The time also allowed me to reflect on how dramatically my life had changed since that conversation in Rick's kitchen when I was 17 years old. The girl who'd been told she wasn't worth a college investment had become an expert witness in one of the largest financial crime prosecutions in the region. The education Rick had dismissed as wasteful had provided the foundation for a career that would help send him to prison. The family relationships that had defined my adolescence had been completely inverted, with me now holding the power to determine the financial future of people who'd once controlled mine. But even as I prepared for the trial and the media attention it would bring, I was beginning to understand that this case represented both the culmination of my inheritance recovery work and a transition to something larger. The expertise I'd developed and the reputation I'd built were creating opportunities that went far beyond individual family disputes. In July, I received a call from a congressional subcommittee investigating financial crimes affecting elderly Americans. They were interested in my perspective on inheritance fraud as a growing threat to family wealth security, and they wanted me to testify about policy recommendations for preventing the kind of systematic theft we'd uncovered in Portland. The invitation to testify before Congress represented a level of professional recognition I'd never imagined possible, but it also meant accepting responsibility for influencing national policy in areas where my expertise had been developed through personal experience with family betrayal and financial manipulation. "You've become more than just a specialist in inheritance recovery," David Kim observed during one of our meetings. "You're becoming a public advocate for inheritance justice, with influence that extends far beyond individual cases." The observation was accurate but also unsettling. I'd entered this field seeking justice for personal wrongs and had discovered a calling helping other families recover stolen wealth. But success in this work was creating opportunities to influence policy and legislation that could affect inheritance rights for millions of families. The responsibility was both exciting and overwhelming. The decisions I made about which cases to accept, how to testify, and what policy recommendations to support could shape how inheritance fraud was prosecuted and prevented throughout the country. As summer progressed and the trial date approached, I found myself thinking frequently about Victoria Ashford's question regarding what happens when someone with my background becomes wealthy enough to influence power structures. The girl who'd been excluded from family financial planning was becoming someone whose expertise could influence national financial policy. The transformation raised questions about my own motivations and values that I hadn't fully considered. Was I seeking justice for inheritance theft victims? Or was I seeking revenge against the systems and people who'd excluded me? Was my work helping families, or was I building personal power and influence using expertise gained from my own victimization? These questions became more pressing in August, when I received an offer that would force me to choose between personal advancement and the principles that had motivated my inheritance recovery work. The call came from a prestigious law firm in New York, offering me a partnership position heading their new inheritance recovery division. The salary was more than double what I was earning in Portland, and the position would involve working with ultra-high net worth families on cases involving hundreds of millions of dollars. "We've been following your work on the Ashford case," the recruiter explained, "and we believe you've developed expertise in an area that's going to become increasingly important as generational wealth transfers accelerate. We want to build a national practice around inheritance recovery, and we think you're the ideal person to lead that effort." The offer was exactly the kind of career opportunity that justified all the years of student loans, work-study jobs, and financial struggle I'd endured. It was also the kind of professional recognition that Rick had predicted I'd never achieve when he refused to support my education. But accepting the position would mean leaving Portland, abandoning the inheritance recovery practice I'd built, and potentially missing the trial where I was scheduled to testify against Rick and the other members of the fraud network. More fundamentally, it would mean choosing personal advancement over the justice work that had given my career meaning and purpose. The New York position would pay more and offer greater prestige, but it would also involve working for wealthy families who could afford expensive legal representation, rather than helping middle-class families recover assets that had been stolen from them. The decision deadline was September 15th, just 1 week before the criminal trial was scheduled to begin. I would have to choose between personal advancement and justice work at the exact moment when my testimony could help ensure that Rick and his co-conspirators faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. As I wrestled with this decision, I realized that Victoria Ashford's question about power and influence had been more prophetic than either of us had understood. The expertise I'd gained from being excluded was creating opportunities for inclusion at the highest levels of the financial services industry. But accepting those opportunities would require abandoning the work that had made me successful in the first place. The girl who'd been told she wasn't worth investing in was being offered the chance to manage investments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But accepting that offer would mean leaving behind the families who were depending on my testimony to recover their own stolen inheritances. The choice would define not just my career trajectory, but also my understanding of what justice meant, and whether my ultimate goal was personal success or systematic change in how inheritance fraud was prosecuted and prevented. The decision came to me on September 12th, 3 days before I had to respond to the New York offer, and 1 week before Rick's trial was scheduled to begin. I was sitting in my office, staring at the contract that would triple my salary and establish me as a national expert in high net worth inheritance recovery, when my assistant buzzed in with a call that would crystallize everything I'd been struggling to understand about my own motivations. "Miss Hartwell, there's a young woman on the phone who says she needs help with an inheritance situation. She sounds upset and mentioned she can't afford attorney fees." The caller was Maria Santos, a 22-year-old college student whose grandmother had recently died, leaving behind what Maria believed was a substantial estate. The problem was that Maria's stepfather, who had married into the family 5 years earlier, was now claiming that the grandmother had died with significant debts and no assets to distribute. "I know my abuela had money," Maria said, her voice shaking with frustration and grief. "She owned rental properties and had been saving for years to help pay for my medical school. But Miguel says there's nothing left, that she spent everything on medical bills before she died." The story was heartbreakingly familiar, down to details that echoed my own experience almost perfectly. A young person pursuing education, a stepfather controlling family finances, and claims that money intended for educational support had mysteriously disappeared. Even Maria's age when her grandmother died, 22, was close to my age when I'd first discovered my father's hidden inheritance. "Have you seen any documentation of your grandmother's assets or the alleged debts?" I asked. "Miguel won't show me anything. He says the paperwork is too complicated for me to understand, and that questioning his management of my abuela's affairs is disrespectful to her memory." I spent an hour on the phone with Maria, walking her through the same investigative steps that had uncovered my own inheritance and helped dozens of other families recover stolen assets. But as we talked, I became increasingly aware that Maria represented exactly the kind of client I would have to abandon if I accepted the New York position. The prestigious law firm wasn't interested in helping college students recover modest inheritances from manipulative stepfathers. They wanted to work with ultra-wealthy families on cases involving tens of millions of dollars, clients who could afford to pay premium rates for specialized expertise. Maria Santos would never be able to afford their services, and her grandmother's estate probably wasn't large enough to justify their attention. But Maria's case was also exactly why I'd become passionate about inheritance recovery work in the first place. She was facing the same dismissal, the same financial manipulation, the same family dynamics that had defined my own experience with Rick. If I couldn't help people like Maria, then what had been the point of everything I'd built over the past several years? "Miss Santos," I said finally, "I'd like to take your case." Pro bono. The relief in her voice was immediate and overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered. I was starting to think no one would believe me. After hanging up, I sat in my office for another hour, thinking about the choice I was facing and what it revealed about the person I'd become versus the person I wanted to be. The New York offer represented everything I thought I'd wanted: financial security, professional prestige, and recognition at the highest levels of the legal and financial services industries. But accepting it would mean abandoning the work that had given my career meaning and leaving behind clients who actually needed the expertise I'd developed. More fundamentally, it would mean choosing personal advancement over the values that had motivated me to pursue inheritance recovery in the first place. The next morning, I called the New York recruiter and declined their offer. The conversation was brief and professional, but I could hear the surprise in his voice when I explained that I was committed to my current practice and the clients who depended on my services. "Ms. Hartwell," he said, "I hope you understand that opportunities like this don't come along often. Are you certain you want to pass this up?" "I'm certain," I replied, and as I said it, I realized that I'd never been more confident about a professional decision. That afternoon, I threw myself into preparing for Rick's trial with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The testimony I would provide wasn't just about holding him accountable for stealing from my father's estate. It was about establishing legal precedents that would help future inheritance recovery cases and sending a message that systematic theft from family trusts would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The trial began on September 20th in federal court, with media coverage that turned the proceedings into a public examination of inheritance fraud throughout the Pacific Northwest. The prosecution's opening statement laid out a comprehensive case involving 17 defendants, millions of dollars in stolen assets, and a criminal enterprise that had operated for over 15 years. Rick sat at the defendants' table in an expensive suit that I now knew had been purchased with money stolen from family trusts, including my father's estate. He looked older and more fragile than I remembered, diminished by the legal proceedings and the public exposure of his crimes. My testimony came on the third day of the trial, and I spent 4 hours on the witness stand detailing how Rick had hidden my inheritance, manipulated trust distributions, and used his position as co-trustee to benefit his own family at the expense of my father's estate planning. The questions from both prosecution and defense attorneys were thorough and sometimes aggressive, but I felt prepared and confident in my responses. "Ms. Hartwell," the prosecutor asked during direct examination, "in your professional opinion, what was the impact of Mr. Brennan's actions on your ability to pursue your education and establish your career?" "Mr. Brennan's theft of my inheritance forced me to take on significant student loan debt and work multiple jobs throughout college," I replied. "More significantly, his deliberate concealment of my father's estate planning was designed to prevent me from understanding my rights and claiming my inheritance when I legally should have been informed." "And what would have been different if you had known about your inheritance at 18? "I would have been able to focus on my education without financial stress, pursue internships and opportunities that I couldn't afford to take, and start my career without the burden of student debt. More importantly, I would have been able to honor my father's intentions for supporting my education and future." The cross-examination was more challenging, with Rick's attorney attempting to portray me as someone seeking revenge rather than justice, and suggesting that my success in inheritance recovery work proved that I hadn't been significantly harmed by his actions. "Ms. Hartwell, isn't it true that your experience with your stepfather's alleged theft actually benefited your career by giving you expertise in inheritance recovery that has made you quite successful?" "My success came from my education and hard work, not from being victimized by theft," I replied firmly. The fact that I was able to build a career helping other families doesn't justify the crimes committed against my family, and it doesn't diminish the harm caused by systematic inheritance fraud. But you've become quite wealthy yourself through this work, haven't you? In fact, you recently turned down a lucrative job offer in New York, which suggests your current practice is quite profitable. The question was designed to suggest that I was financially motivated rather than seeking justice. But it also gave me an opportunity to explain why I'd chosen to continue my inheritance recovery work rather than pursue personal advancement. I turned down that offer because helping families recover stolen inheritances is more important to me than personal profit, I said. The choice between making more money and doing meaningful work isn't difficult when you understand how devastating inheritance theft can be for families. Tyler's testimony the following day was even more powerful, providing insider details about Rick's criminal activities and his systematic manipulation of family finances. Watching my stepbrother testify against his father was both satisfying and heartbreaking, as he described years of discovering the truth about his family's wealth and making the moral choice to expose wrongdoing despite the personal cost. I realized that my college education, my trust fund, and many of the opportunities I'd been given were paid for with money stolen from other families, Tyler said during his testimony. I couldn't live with that knowledge without taking action to make it right. My mother's testimony was perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial, as she detailed her gradual discovery of Rick's criminal activities and her decision to cooperate with investigators despite the personal consequences. Her voice was steady but emotional as she described finding evidence of money laundering and systematic theft. I spent years enabling his behavior because I was afraid of losing my financial security, she said. But I finally realized that living comfortably on stolen money was worse than facing the truth about what kind of man I'd married. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive, presenting financial records, witness testimony, and expert analysis that demonstrated the scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprise. Rick's defense attorney argued that his client had been following legal advice and operating within the bounds of trust management authority. But the evidence of deliberate deception and theft was overwhelming. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Rick was convicted of conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud, money laundering, and multiple counts of theft from family trusts. The sentences wouldn't be announced for several weeks, but the convictions carried potential prison terms of up to 20 years. The moment when the verdicts were read was both climactic and anticlimactic. After years of seeking justice for Rick's theft and months of preparing for trial, the actual legal resolution felt almost routine. Rick showed no emotion as the verdicts were announced, and he was led away in handcuffs without making eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. But the real satisfaction came afterward, when the prosecutors announced that the convictions had helped them recover over $40 million in stolen assets that would be returned to the families who'd been victimized. What would that look like practically? I asked. We could restructure your role here to focus primarily on complex inheritance and family dispute cases. You'd still be affiliated with Pacific Northwest Trust Management, but you'd have more autonomy to develop your own client base and set your own fee structure. Think of it as a partnership track position with a specialty focus. The proposal was exactly the kind of professional recognition I'd dreamed about during those years of working multiple jobs to pay for college. More than that, it was an opportunity to turn my own painful experience into a tool for helping others navigate similar challenges. I spent the weekend considering David's offer, walking through the Pearl District neighborhoods where I'd built my independent life, thinking about the trajectory that had brought me from Rick's kitchen dismissal to this moment of professional opportunity. The irony wasn't lost on me that the inheritance recovery work was essentially a more sophisticated version of what I'd been doing in the university's financial aid office, helping people understand complex financial systems and advocating for resources they deserved but hadn't been able to access. Monday morning brought my decision and a phone call that would test my new professional focus in ways I hadn't anticipated. I accepted David's offer to restructure my role, and less than an hour later, my assistant transferred a call from someone whose name made my stomach drop. Miss Hartwell? This is Tyler Brennan. I think we need to talk. My stepbrother's voice was strained, lacking the casual confidence I remembered from our recent encounter in the trust office. I hadn't spoken to any member of the Brennan family since the settlement had been finalized, and I'd assumed our business was permanently concluded. Hello, Tyler, I said carefully. What can I help you with? It's about my father, and some things I found in his office that I think you should know about. Could we meet somewhere private? This isn't something I can discuss over the phone. The request was unexpected and potentially complicated. Whatever Tyler had discovered, it clearly involved Rick and had some connection to my inheritance situation. My first instinct was to decline, to maintain the professional distance I'd established with my former family. But something in Tyler's tone suggested this wasn't a casual attempt to rebuild family relationships. "I can meet you for coffee tomorrow afternoon," I said finally. "But I should mention that any information you share with me might be subject to professional reporting requirements, depending on what it involves." We arranged to meet at a small cafe in southeast Portland, far from both our offices and the neighborhoods where we'd grown up. I spent the evening wondering what Tyler might have found and whether I was making a mistake by agreeing to see him. The next afternoon, Tyler was already waiting when I arrived at the cafe, sitting in a corner booth with a manila envelope, and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd been rehearsing this conversation for days. He looked older than I remembered, more serious, like he'd been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about his family. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as I sat down across from him. "I wasn't sure you would, given everything that's happened. What's this about, Tyler?" He pushed the manila envelope across the table. "I found these papers in Dad's office last week. I was helping him organize files for an insurance audit, and I came across a folder marked Hartwell Estate Confidential. I probably shouldn't have looked, but when I saw your father's name, I opened the envelope and found myself looking at documents I'd never seen before, including what appeared to be original copies of my father's will and trust agreements. But these weren't the same versions Mr. Morrison had shown me. These documents included additional pages, amendments, and notations that significantly changed the scope of my inheritance." "Tyler, where exactly did you find these?" "In Dad's personal safe, along with a bunch of other paperwork that goes back to when he first married your mom. There's more stuff, but this seemed like the most important." I studied the documents more carefully, my heart rate increasing as I began to understand what I was looking at. The trust agreement in Tyler's envelope included provisions I'd never heard about, additional assets that hadn't been mentioned in the official estate proceedings, and most significantly, a clause that made Rick himself a potential beneficiary under certain circumstances. According to these documents, my father's trust hadn't just provided monthly distributions to my mother after his death. It had also included a provision that if my mother remarried, her new spouse would become a co-trustee with authority to make investment decisions for the trust assets. Rick hadn't just been passively receiving money that was transferred to his accounts, he'd actually been legally authorized to manage my inheritance for years. But that wasn't the most shocking revelation. The final page of the trust agreement included an amendment dated just months before my father's death, adding a clause that would transfer a substantial portion of the trust assets to any children Rick might have if I failed to claim my inheritance by age 30. Tyler wasn't just Rick's son. Under the terms of this amendment, he was potentially entitled to hundreds of thousands of dollars from my father's estate. "Did you know about this?" I asked, holding up the amendment. Tyler shook his head, his expression genuinely confused. "I had no idea any of this existed until I found those papers. Dad never mentioned your father's money, and I always assumed the college fund he set up for me came from his construction business." The implications were staggering. Rick hadn't just hidden my inheritance from me. He'd actively positioned himself and his son to benefit from it if I remained unaware of my rights. The monthly distributions he'd been receiving weren't theft in the traditional sense. They were payments he was legally entitled to receive as co-trustee. But his failure to inform me of my inheritance rights when I turned 18 was a deliberate breach of his fiduciary duty, designed to ensure that I would miss the deadline for claiming my full inheritance. "Tyler, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did your father ever discuss the terms under which you might inherit additional money beyond what he'd saved from his business?" Tyler was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking back through years of conversations. "There was something," he said finally. "When I was in college, Dad mentioned that there might be some additional family money available when I turned 30, something about trust structures and estate planning. He said it was complicated and that I shouldn't worry about it until the time came." The picture was becoming clearer. Rick had planned to let me remain ignorant of my inheritance until I reached 30, at which point the amendment would have transferred a significant portion of my father's estate to Tyler. It was a long-term strategy designed to redirect my inheritance to Rick's biological son while maintaining plausible deniability about his actions. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked Tyler. "According to these documents, you could have been entitled to hundreds of thousands of dollars if I'd never found out about the trust." Tyler looked genuinely uncomfortable with the question. "Because it's not right," he said finally. "Your dad died when you were 9 years old. He left that money for you, not for us. Finding out that my college education was paid for with money that should have gone to your college education, it makes me sick." His response surprised me. I'd expected Tyler to defend his father's actions, or to argue that he'd received the money in good faith. Instead, he seemed genuinely disturbed by the discovery of how our family's finances had been structured. "What do you want to happen now?" I asked. The teenager who's told she's not worth investing in grows up to become someone who can hold those same people accountable for their choices and help other families avoid similar exploitation. Today, as I review files for next week's cases and prepare for a conference presentation on inheritance fraud prevention, I sometimes think about that 17-year-old girl standing in Rick's kitchen, being told that family money goes to blood family first, second, and always. She could never have imagined that those words would eventually become the foundation for a career dedicated to ensuring that family money goes to the people who were intended to receive it, regardless of whose blood runs through their veins. The education Rick refused to fund gave me the tools to expose his crimes and help dozens of other families recover from similar theft. The independence he forced me to develop became the foundation for expertise that now influences national policy on inheritance fraud prevention. The exclusion from his family's financial planning led me to a career devoted to protecting other families from the same kind of manipulation. Sometimes justice takes longer than we expect, and sometimes it comes in forms we never anticipated. But when it finally arrives, it often brings with it opportunities to ensure that future victims won't face the same challenges we endured. The girl who was deemed unworthy of investment became the woman who helps ensure that family wealth actually serves family interests, and that's a transformation that no amount of stolen money could have prevented. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.